Okay, good evening everybody, and you're all very welcome to the second lecture of our 2025 series, and you're all most welcome. However, this evening I have to really begin on a note of sadness, because last Friday we learned that our colleague and friend, Professor Martin McLaughlin, sadly passed away after a long battle with illness. And many of you will remember Martin for the exceptional lecture that he gave to the Dante lecture series back in February 2023. And I would recommend everyone to go to our YouTube channel to watch it, like I did over the weekend, and witness true erudition delivered with grace, rigor, and humour. Martin's passing will be felt across the whole range of Italian studies, I think, in the UK and internationally. For its breadth, his interests encompass so many things, from Dante, Petrarca, and Boccaccio, the Renaissance in particular, and Alberti, a wonderful book of Princeton University Press, to the modern age and his groundbreaking work on Italo Calvino, amongst other things. A gentleman, a true scholar, and a proud Scot with Irish heritage. He'll be sorely missed, and may he rest in peace. And I think it is almost a strange coincidence that we have Professor Zygmunt Baranski with us this evening. Zig was a very good friend of Martin's, and together they edited these two wonderful volumes, issued 3 crowns for a wonderful exhibition in Oxford, and then this wonderful volume, Dante the Lyric and Ethical Poet. I think maybe Zig might say something at the beginning of his lecture. But I do want to introduce Professor Baranski properly, because it's taken many, many years to get him here, and something always conspired, COVID, illnesses, but finally he has come to GCC to speak in person at our series. Because when we talk of Dantisti of international fame and stature, Professor Baranski is truly that, and one of the very few people who can bridge the Italian and Anglophone worlds of Dante scholarship. Such is the scene in which he's held. He's emeritus or canale professor of Romance languages and literatures at the University of Notre Dame, and also Serena professor of Italian emeritus at the University of Cambridge. His interests are wide. He has done so much. I could spend the next half an hour telling you about his many, many publications and various research interests, but I will mention a couple of publications I think are important. For example, the Italian novel, a book I read with great interest back in 1993, Luce Nuova, Sole Nuovo, Saggi Studi Movimento Culturale Dante, in 1996, The Fiore in Context, Dante, France, Tuscany, with Patrick Boyd, Pasolini, Old and New, Surveys and Studies, 1999. He did that with Four Courts Press in Dublin. Dante Segni, Saggi per una storia intellettuale di Dante, 2000. Chiosar con alto testo, leggere Dante nel Trecento, 2001. The Cambridge Companion to Modern Italian Culture with Rebecca West. Petrarch and Dante, Anti-Dantism, Metaphysics, Tradition with Ted Catchy in 2009. Dante in Context with Lino Pertile, that was at Cambridge University Press. The Cambridge Companion to Dante's Commedia with Simon Gilson in 2019. And the wonderful Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Literature, Doctrine and Reality in 2020. And also these 2 wonderful volumes that I just mentioned that he did with Martin. The title of Zig's lecture this evening is La forma universale di questo nodo, the structures of Dante's afterlife. So please join me in welcoming Professor Baranski.
Thank you for the invitation, and also for the kind way in which you've introduced me. The real reason why I haven't come previously to court, yes, once I was unwell, but the other times is because there's something that I do take seriously beyond my family, which is following Manchester United. And I go to every game, literally. And we couldn't quite guarantee that there may not have been a match which would have coincided with the date of a lecture, and hence I would say no, because I'm not sure whether we're still going to be in the League Cup or not, so sorry, can't come. But this season it's worked out, you know. So that's the real reason. Martin McLaughlin, who is one of my closest friends, was a Celtic fan. Indeed, I didn't know this, he never told me, Martin, all the conversations we had together, and many of them were about football, that a member of his family was amongst the founders of Celtic Football Club. And I've long felt, and I hope Martin felt the same, that we actually our lives ran along parallel tracks. He's slightly younger than me, a matter of a few months. But if one were to look at the way in which our academic and intellectual careers developed, there's a lot in common. And ours was a very warm friendship. And I know it was a warm friendship because he's amongst the few academics that I know with whom I spent more time talking about things that were not academic. Our families, football, politics, music, lots of other issues were what we talked about, as you do with your friends. That doesn't mean that one doesn't also have friends who have academic interests. Of course, Martin and I talked about that as well, but it was just something amongst the many other things. And I'll always be very grateful for that with Martin, that we were able to have this sort of warm human relationship. I have a rather cynical view of academia, I'll be perfectly honest with you. And as I get older, I feel less bothered about being open about it. Academics are a weird bunch, in my view, and they're not always the most warm and generous of people. There's a lot of pettiness in our world, alas. And I've always found that rather distressing, which may be one reason why I've always kept myself apart as much as I possibly could from the academic mainstream. How you end up as an endowed professor in Cambridge by doing that, that's another story, and perhaps one day I'll even talk about it. So, if I can, I will dedicate this lecture to Martin's memory, as I will various written versions of things that I hope to complete over the next few months. I desperately miss Martin. So I just need a moment. You're guinea pigs tonight. You're guinea pigs in two ways. One, what I'm going to talk about is not even research in progress. It's something before research in progress. It's something I may turn into a research project, or I may not. So we're testing out some ideas with you. Some will be barely formed, others will be quite well formed because I've already written them up and indeed are in the process of publishing them. But what I'm trying to do is think through, as you'll see, and I'll come back to them in a moment, a set of problems which may or may not then crystallize into something more coherent. The other reason you're guinea pigs is a much more personal one. I'm nearly 74. I've spent the whole of my life, as some of you know, talking a braccio. I very rarely read anything. I will if it's a conference, etc. And as I've grown older, I've begun to wonder whether I can still stand up and just talk to you. Because literally one's mind, one's memory alters as you grow older. In some ways, as I was saying to colleagues just a few moments ago, I actually feel that I've written some of the best work and done some of the best research I've done in my life since I retired 4 years ago. On the other hand, to be able to stand up and just talk, it is a different exercise. You have to have a kind of mental and mnemonic agility, which perhaps I no longer have. And it's not just a kind of captatio benevolentia, just saying, be kind to the old guy standing up at the front with the rickety joints. No, it's a serious issue. And there's going to come the moment, which I hope isn't tonight, but it may be. And they're even recording it, the moment when I collapse in front of an audience, not knowing what to say. Or, as my kids and others have said, Dad, you spent your whole life bullshitting. Perhaps you can go do it for a little bit longer. So what am I going to talk about? The title is pretty self-explanatory. I want to talk about the structures of Dante's afterlife, the way in which Dante represents the afterlife. Now, you may think, well, it's such an obvious thing. He is losing his marbles, that guy, you know. It's such an obvious topic. Hasn't everything been said about it? One of the problems with Dante's scholarship is that it's based upon untested truisms. I wrote a piece about this a few years ago. If any of you are interested, it's called In Dante's Wake, and it came out in Italian Studies, where I did a kind of overarching assessment of the way in which Dantismo works. And there's so much stuff published on Dante every year that we need those truisms. We need something to base, to kind of fix points of departure from which we can then build our own research project. That's very dangerous if you think about it. When I say that a huge amount is published on Dante, apparently I haven't checked this, but it seems, you know, there's a kind of common perception that after the Bible, the text on which most is written is the Divine Comedy or the Commedia. And naturally, you can't keep up. Even someone, those of you who may have read something by me, know I write extremely long and boring footnotes because I do try to stay on top of where my field is, because I worry that if I don't, I won't be able to say something that has a minimum sort of validity and of interest. And the truism I want to depart from is something that I have said thousands of times, literally thousands of times. Inferno is about hell, Purgatorio is about purgatory, Paradiso is about paradise. No, they're not. That's wrong. It is wrong. You can go to the text of the poem and document that what I've just said, and what some of you will have said many times, is in fact textually incorrect. It's true as far as hell is concerned. But when we come to purgatory, it's not true. Purgatory, that place where souls are purged of their sinful dispositions, is only the central part of the mountain that Dante located highly originally. There is no such island anywhere in any medieval map at the bottom of the southern hemisphere. What the Purgatorio is about, and I'm going to try to be coherent in the way I speak. I will give Dante's original title in Italian for the canticle, and I will use hell, purgatory, paradise, or empyrean for that particular zone of the afterlife. Purgatorio deals with an island that is at least divided into three distinct areas. We have what we term anti-purgatory, anti-purgatorio, which is not a term of Dante's coinage, but it was actually coined by the late 14th century commentator Benvenuto da Imola. We have a central section that goes from Canto 10 to Canto 27. So Cantos 1 to 9 is anti-purgatory. But I'll already let you into a secret. Even what I've just said to you, that 1 to 9 is about anti-purgatory, is in fact incorrect. But I don't want to muddle things up too much at the moment. I'll come back and do a bit more muddling in a little while. Then we have a central panel, which is purgatory. And Dante makes it very clear that only that part is purgatory. There's a couple of quotations on your handout that make that clear. And then from 27 to 33, we find ourselves in the Garden of Eden. So Purgatorio is not about purgatory, or it's not exclusively about purgatory. It's about this weird island which is divided up into three different areas. The idea of bringing together Eden and purgatory is Dante's. The idea of having let's call it a pre-purgatory and anti-purgatory, there is no trace in the tradition of such a space. It's entirely original. And yet it's one of the least studied parts of Dante's Afterlife. There is very little on anti-purgatory, and most of it is pretty ropey, and I'm being kind and polite. We then come to Paradiso. Paradiso is only about paradise. I will use the term the Empyrean, which is more commonly used in Dante studies, from Canto 30 to the end of Canto 33. The previous 30, 1 to 30 to that point in 30 where the transition occurs, is a voyage through the physical universe. The pilgrim, accompanied by Beatrice, rises up through the heavens of the Ptolemaic Aristotelian universe. It is still part of this reality, of this world. It's at most, as Beatrice explains in Paradiso 4, it is a sign, a symbol, a figure, a symbolic representation of what paradise is actually like. I used to give a lecture, a kind of general lecture to a sort of general audience. One of the things that's interesting about being a Dantist is that there are lots of people who are non-professional Dantists who are mad keen on Dante. I've recently been sort of giving kind of talks and workshops and seminars for some church groups in Reading. And it's extremely interesting because people ask you some, often really crazy questions, but some of those crazy questions are actually very stimulating and make you go back and think things through and say, yeah, there's actually something behind that crazy question. They're actually seeing things in a way which is perhaps, more interesting than the way I, as a professional Dantist, are looking at it. And I gave this lecture, which was, why is the Paradiso not about paradise? And I've just given you a very brief summation as to why it is not about paradise. But even when we arrive at the Empyrean, those of you who've read Paradise are very aware that Dante, during the course of the journey through the physical universe, through the heavens, up to the outer limit of the physical universe, namely the primum mobile, before he transitions into the Empyrean, which exists out of time, out of place, and exists exclusively in the mind of God, he complains, I can't remember anything. And all that, there's a constant ineffability is one of the structuring sort of elements of the way in which the first 30 cantos or so of Paradise are actually structured. Because and for us as readers, it's very demanding. There's an element and way in which Paradiso is alienating, in the way in which the journey for the pilgrim is alienating. In that all there is light, and we hear things. There's lots of conversation, speeches. And what we have there, actually, is, of course, Dante, remember that this is a text, it's a poem, it's representation. He's showing off his artistic prowess. He's showing his ability to be able to captivate our attention by limiting what it is that he can describe. Of course, you can do a lot with light. You can use all sorts of metaphors, images of light. You can have lights doing all sorts of interesting things, then aligning themselves into all sorts of different shapes, whether it's crosses or eagles, etc., etc. So it's very creative, but it's also limiting. And Dante wants to appreciate what he is able to do despite the restrictions and limitations. But once we get into the Empyrean, the stress is now we're seeing paradise. We're actually there in front and seeing paradise because he can describe, because after he's bathed his eyes in the river of light, he can see the blessed in the celestial rose. He can see the angels. There's, as Lino Pertila says in one of his essays dealing with the Empyrean, he says that what happens, what's one of the characteristics of those final canti, and he's absolutely correct, although no one before him, as far as I'm aware, had noticed it. And again, it's a very obvious thing, that he remarks on is that Dante becomes hugely descriptive because he can describe, because all of a sudden now he can see the celestial roads, this sort of amphitheatre where the blessed are supposed to reside, the angels flying up. He then meets St. Bernard, he can describe him, there's the Virgin, etc. And then in the final part, there's the movement towards God, and that which he cannot describe, which is the visio Dei, the union with God, the vision of God. So it's a commonplace, it's a standard, another standard truism in Dante studies to say the final 4 canti, 3 and a bit canti, part of 30, 31, 32, 33, they present us with paradise. Dante is now able to reveal the reality of paradise. And I say to that, that's wrong as well. It's nonsense. And it's nonsense for one very simple reason. How can a human being retain a memory of something, give you the reality of something that exists in the mind of God? Because if a human being who returns to earth is able to do that, then that human being is on a par with God. The whole point of, as I'm sure you all know, the nature of human divine relations is that they can only be mediated. But Dante seems to suggest, and it is simply a suggestion, and Dante scholarship has absolutely grabbed it and accepted it as gospel, that what we are seeing, and you'll find it everywhere, this is the reality of paradise. People use those phrases, eminent Dante scholars. But it can't be. If you just think about it for a moment, how can it be that all of a sudden the pilgrim, the traveler, is able, if he's had difficulty in describing the beauty of Beatrice, as he tells us time and again, and he tells us just before he enters into the Empyrean, and this is done quite deliberately. If he tells us that I can't describe Beatrice, and then we enter into paradise, and he can describe paradise, how is that possible? Now, I've written at length at this. I don't want to sort of belabor the point. If you're interested, I'm sure Dara can sort of point you in the right direction. It's a piece written in Italian, unfortunately, if there are those who, who are not Italianists and may be interested. But one of the interesting things as well that Dante does is all of a sudden, when in the Empyrean, he has no problems. There is no issue of ineffability. Not once does he say, I cannot describe what I'm seeing. Again, if you think it through, how is that possible? Of course, it's all possible because it's rhetoric, it's poetry, it's representation. He is not actually describing paradise, guys. And yet some of my colleagues, who themselves are sort of card-carrying atheists, especially the ones in Italy, where the anti-clericalism of humanities professors is well known, come out with statements like that. In part, it's because they don't have a sophisticated enough understanding of issues relating to human divine relations and the whole theology around that. But common sense should tell us that what we've got is a hugely complex rhetorical operation, which is based about making us, on the one hand, believe that we're seeing paradise. But at the end, Dante actually then undermines himself. I won't go into the details of how he does it, but he makes very clear that what we're seeing is, in fact, yet another representation. It's yet another sign. It's yet another figure. It's yet another symbolic representation. And it's obvious if we just step back. There's a very brilliant book by a colleague from Colombia called Teodolinda Barolini. And since I'll only mention names of those who I feel have made a really valuable contribution. When I criticize, I never name it. It's not fair. I make more than my share of mistakes, and I'm more than well aware of my own limitations. But Teo Barolini sort of, really wrote a book called The Undivine Comedy, which was much misunderstood because people looked at the title and got the wrong end of the stick. It's actually a defense of the way in which Dante presents the theological aspect and the way in which he manipulates us through the power of his poetry, through the power of his rhetoric. He manipulates us to believe that what he describes is not a fiction, it's actually true. And she does it in an incredibly sort of effective way. But if we step back, what Beatrice says in Canto 4 of Paradiso is that what you're seeing is simply a symbol, as I've already mentioned, of what the reality of paradise is like. So the assumption is then made, the jump, as I've tried to explain, that therefore once we enter into the Empyrean, this is what paradise is like. Now, if the heavens and the way in which the souls align themselves in the heavens, because they come down specially, remember, what a privilege. God sends them all down. You know, he blows a whistle at a certain point and says, hey, you lot, get down there. There's this guy coming up on this journey that I've divinely sanctioned. Go and sort of array yourselves in the different heavens, meet him, and then afterwards, and this happens in Canto 23 with the triumph of Christ and the Virgin, they all go zooming back up into paradise. That's actually what happens. You know, it's done much more elegantly and effectively than that, but fundamentally that is the way in which things are organized. What you find, you know, these remarkable, no one else in their descriptions of the afterlife was as bold, dared as much. And it's really what I'm thinking about. Is there a project to write about the way in which Dante completely reconfigures a whole tradition of writing about the afterlife that goes right back into the classical times and then into the Christian tradition? Because I'm sure if you know, the concern of what is the afterlife like is a constant. And by the 14th century, as at least there's one graduate student here working on sort of Irish visions of the afterlife in Dante, is a huge mass of writing, much of which still we haven't really, lies in manuscript, because it's everywhere. Often what we say, oh, the vision of X, it's not actually a self-standing text, the vision of X, it's embedded into another text. I won't have time I may have time to talk about it. One of the most influential for Dante, the vision of Dryfelm or Driffelm by Bede, it's actually embedded in the history of the English peoples. It's just a brief moment, a brief episode in that. So when we get to the Empyrean, one of the things you learn, I talk in circles, I move around, keep the audience awake, a little bit like Dante, he's constantly challenging us, he's constantly undermining us as readers, he's constantly posing questions. He wants us to stay alert, because if we're not alert, how are we going to save our souls? This is the work that says, change the way you live. Follow the example that you hear. If you don't, you're going to get in trouble. But if you do, there's a lot of reward waiting for you. What's the correlation? If the heavens are supposed to be a symbol for paradise, show me the correlation between what the pilgrim sees, hears, experiences in the heavens and the way in which then in the Empyrean, he describes the Empyrean. There is no correlation. So there are incredibly poor. So what he sees what he experiences as he travels up through the heavens is a very poor approximation of what he will then see in the Empyrean, which itself is not paradise, because he as a living human being cannot experience that which is in the mind of God, as he tells us at the end of the poem itself, because at the moment when he achieves union with God, what happens? He can't remember anything, because that's the nature. Once there is a direct contact between the human and divine, zap. What he calls the high fantasy stops, and he's using it in a technical sense, which is different to the way in which we use fantasy, but it's linked to sort of Aristotelian psychology, etc. You cannot retain the divine. All that we can say that the Empyrean is, i.e. the representation of the Empyrean that the pilgrim sees, is that it is a superior symbolic representation of what paradise is actually like to the one that he had experienced previously. And it's made very clear that what he is describing, because Dante always leaves clues. It's up to us to then to find this. He has a very complex sign system all the way through, not just the Commedia, but all his texts. Because he wants to control the reader to a certain extent, as well as challenge them, as well as sort of engage them. And he says, what he asks God for help, and it's incredibly indicative, he asks God for help to adire cum io lo vidi, to recount as I saw it, not to recount the truth of paradise, which is what is conventionally said. No, he wants to be able to recount what he saw once he bathed his eyes in the river of light, which is again, i.e., what he saw as a human being, as a living person. Not, otherwise, as I've said, he would be on a par with God, or at least on a par with the blessed and the angels who have a completely different experience of paradise. So Dante's Paradiso is never about paradise. At best, it is about first of all, it's a journey through the physical universe, which itself becomes a symbol for what paradise is like, but a very poor approximation, which again, if you think about it in doctrinal terms, is entirely reasonable, because, the gulf between the human and the divine, which is one of the great themes of the poem, is enormous. Without the grace of God, it's unsurmountable. And that then, at a certain point, we get a slightly more sophisticated symbolic representation of what paradise is actually like. The pilgrim claims to have been there, and there's no reason, I'm accepting the text on its own premise that Dante claims that he actually went on this journey. I always thought of, especially when I taught at a Catholic university where, unlike myself and the majority of students I taught previously, the majority of people I had sitting in front of me in class were people who were practicing Catholics, and for whom, in many ways, it was actually quite easy to teach Dante to them, because they got it. For them, some of the things I'm saying to now, they found much less demanding that different audiences to theirs found. They also obviously knew that all students at Notre Dame get a very sophisticated sort of education in both philosophy and theology. They know the Bible, etc. All stuff that if you teach Dante, or if you're a Dantist, you need to, know in a reasonably professional manner, etc. So they found it much more, it's actually quite hard for us at times to, as people who may not be persons of faith, to sort of maneuver. On the one hand, that if we're going to read the text, we have to accept that Dante is making claims that he actually went on this journey, that he has been divinely ordained to go on this journey, and that the poem is in many ways akin to the Bible, because like the Bible, it is a text that is a cui ha posto mano et cielo et terra, to which both heaven and earth have put a hand to the composition, which was a standard concept, it's a commonplace, of the way in which the scriptural books were written, i.e. God inspired the authors, but then he left it up to the individual authors to choose the words on the page. So that's why Dante can claim to be a better writer than, let's say, David, who is considered the sort of the highest of scriptural poets, because he's saying not that I'm somehow that the inspiration that David had, mine is superior, but I'm better as a wordsmith. I'm a better poet than David, because he's evaluating himself in terms of sort of, their earthly status, their earthly ability. Now, I hope that you've begun to see that the way in which Dante deals with the afterlife is at a level of complexity which is not common. Although Dante is an author who roots himself in the tradition, in the broadest sense. Whilst on the one hand, he is one of the greatest experimenters of Western culture, possibly the greatest, and also someone who is able to synthesize, syncretize different traditions. On the other, he never detaches himself from the tradition. So Dante's account of the afterlife has its basis, if you want, its point of reference, its point of comparison, is in those traditions of voyages and visions of the afterlife. It's in relation to the mystical tradition. It's in relation to that other tradition, of which a work like Alan of Lille's Anticlaudianus, of voyages through the heavens up to an encounter with the divine, etc. All those traditions are there, and he wants us to be thinking of them. He may not want us to be thinking of specific texts, in part because, you know, as I'm sure some of you know, it's extremely difficult to pinpoint precise sources when it comes to these popularizing texts. It's the visions and the voyages. It's somewhat easier in relation to the sort of much more sophisticated, intellectually complex works written by the contemplatives. So we know that Dante draws reasonably heavily on Bonaventure's Itinerarium, you know, Journey Towards God, as well as Richard of St. Victor. We've been able, you know, scholars have been able to pinpoint quite convincingly that Dante is drawing from that particular text rather than, let's say, from the Pseudo-Dionysius. Although what Pseudo-Dionysius say is, and again, this shows how complex ways of studying sources can be, it's not that Dante has read the Pseudo-Dionysius directly. Most of it comes from his reading in other sources, in particular Albertus Magnus, who uses the Pseudo-Dionysius, or in Aquinas, who also draws on the Pseudo-Dionysius. And you can demonstrate that by saying, well, people say this comes from Pseudo. Yes, but then that's precisely the passage that both Thomas and Albertus Magnus cite, and we don't then find anything else from that particular text elsewhere. And therefore, you know, that's come through a sort of mediated process. So what we need to think about is the way in which Dante relates towards a tradition. He must have read individual texts. He may have read many of them, but which they are to this date, unless, you know, our friend here who's working on the visions and voyages of the Irish tradition is able to pinpoint something precisely, it's actually very hard. It's not least because these texts themselves repeat certain standardized tropes. Now, the one thing that's immediately striking about the difference between Dante's vision of the afterlife and the way in which these are dealt with in those traditions is that those traditions, in general, with one or two exceptions, are pretty chaotic. They throw everything in the kitchen sink. They're also highly descriptive. The standard representation of the human person in those accounts is anonymous, i.e. they're there to suffer or enjoy, you know, the conditions in which they find themselves. There are certain individuals that are highlighted in certain texts, but they tend again to be, there's nothing of the sophistication and complexity that we have, you know, in Dante. To put it in very blunt and crude terms, there is no Francesca in any of the visions and voyages of the afterlife that I have read. But as I've warned you, there are many that still await to be, they're lying around either in manuscript, have never been edited, or they're in other texts. And in order to read, what we have, and again, this is a very delimiting, and I'm the first one to admit that the corpus with which I'm working, and I've read a bit beyond it, is a very limited one. Most of us who work on the voyages and visions go to 2 or 3 anthologies that are, you know, that are quite well and largely used, and they are of major texts. So they are, but they are simply, if not quite just the peak of the iceberg. I'm not quite sure how much more of the iceberg there is, but there is an iceberg. Just for instance, in the tradition of St. Patrick's Purgatory, because it's relevant for here, but it's also a good example, there's individual national traditions, first of all. So to put it, we were just chatting before, there's an Italian tradition of St. Patrick's Purgatory, which then fragments in all sorts of different directions. There's different traditions right across Europe. You know, I cite from a particular edition saying, yeah, I know, it's the best I can do, but it's what I've got to hand. When I cite St. Patrick's Purgatory, because I'm not trying to pinpoint sources, I'm trying to see how things work. So it may be that what I'm saying to you is a load of rubbish, because people come out and suddenly find that there are these texts where are these hugely complex, psychologically believable Francesca-like figures. Unlikely, but you never know, because I haven't read everything. And, you know, if there's somebody wants a nice project as a medievalist, they should just go and sort of start cataloging and sort of doing typologies of these different texts that deal with, you know, representations of the afterlife. And this project, as I'm thinking about, is the way in which Dante is trying to make coherent. What characterizes Dante's afterlife is that it's highly sophisticated. It's highly complex. One of the things that is characteristic of many of the voyages and visions, you've got sort of hell and purgatory next to each other. In fact, the same thing seems to be happening. Both hell and purgatory are characterized by fire in many accounts. And then just down the road, all of a sudden the Voyager arrives at a beautiful place full of light, etc. Nothing could be more different from the way in which Dante constructs his afterlife. The distance separating even just hell and the island is huge, and Dante emphasizes the distance. You have to travel all the way through the southern hemisphere in order to arrive at the island. And then that island itself is very carefully distinguished. We have anti-purgatory, then purgatory, then Eden. And purgatory is divided up carefully into 7 cornices, which are based upon the 7 vices, 7 cardinal vices. In Inferno, Dante categorizes different types of sin: the sins of incontinence, sins of violence, sins of fraud, fraud simple and fraud complex. And he draws upon classical authorities. We won't go into the whys and wherefores, we all know that. So there's an attempt to give a sense of coherence, of intellectual clarification for the way in which the afterlife is all. You know, the main reason I feel he does that is in order to give us a clear sense of the complexity and sophistication and the justness of God's justice. On the other hand, there are many tensions, many things that don't work in Dante's afterlife. Just let me give you one example from hell. When in Canto 11, Virgil explains the moral system of hell, he mentions malice twice. And in one definition of malice, he says that the whole of lower hell is divided up into, I should have checked that before I came out, that a whole area is dominated by malice. A bit further on, he then divides that same area up into malice and matta bestialità, mad bestiality. Now, you can't have both. The two don't work. There is an answer to that, at least I think there's an answer. It's the fact that it's Virgil speaking, and and all the sort of ramifications that one can take from that. So the idea that everything is perfect in the act is actually not true. There are all sorts of tensions. Already the tension that exists between the heavens and the Empyrean. But in the time that I've got left, I want to sort of linger in anti-purgatory, which is the most original part of Dante's afterlife. Whilst there is some precedent for all the other parts of Dante's afterlife, there is no precedent for anti-purgatory. Why? Why does Dante create anti-purgatory? Why does he dedicate 9 canti to this particular area of the afterlife? Now, one very simple and banal answer is that it's part of this project to completely refashion the afterlife, that Dante becomes the author of the definitive account of the afterlife. If he claims, as I mentioned earlier, that he went on this journey through the afterlife, then he's the authority on it, in the way that he's the authority on what happened to Ulysses. There were many different, as you know, conflicting and competing stories as to what happened to the hero from Ithaca. But the one we get is from the horse's mouth, it's from Ulysses itself. There's this constant claim. Again, it's rhetorical. It's a con trick that Dante's playing on us in the same way that Ulysses played a con trick on the poor guys who were in the boat with him. That we're getting now the sort of the genuine account, the one that works, the non-messy one. The idea of clearly distinguishing between different types of sinners, as Dante does in hell. It's not a feature of most of the visions and voyages, or even of distinguishing different orders of the blessed. No, they're just blessed. They're all there happy, sitting on their clouds or the equivalent, you know. They're just, the idea that there's hierarchies, complexities, and Dante deals with that issue of hierarchy, of difference, doesn't he? Right from the very start of Paradiso. Again, so there's different degrees of blessedness. They're fully satisfied, but each of us has an individual relationship to God and all the other blessed, etc. Why anti-purgatory? Why do you introduce? Why can't people just go straight to purgatory? Why can't they start? They've repented. They've said sorry to God. God has forgiven them, as is made very clear by the first major character that we meet, who's actually involved in the process, because Casella, whom Dante meets, it's on the beach. And the beach is another weird place, as I said, that may be a fourth area of purgatory. I said, there may be time for me to tell you about it, there may not, who knows? It's Manfred. You know, Manfred makes it very clear that he's repented and God has forgiven, and he becomes an emblematic sort of penitent, in the way that Francesca is an emblematic sinner. So if they're forgiven, why can't they start? Why can't they start on their process of purgation? What is it that they've done that they cannot? If God's forgiven you, and he says his sins are horrible. Horribil furono I peccati miei. Dreadful, awful, mortal sins. Why can't he go? There's nothing, and I mean nothing, in the theological tradition to legitimate what Dante's doing. Indeed, he's causing theological chaos, havoc. Nice pause there, you know. Dante causing theological havoc. Yeah. And he really is. So let's think about what's going on there. If we jump to purgatory, let's just forget anti-purgatory. What is it that's going on in purgatory? The souls, they suffer terrible tortures. Tortures that are equivalent and akin to those of hell. And in a sense, that is in structural, in very loose terms, what's happening in the tradition. Because in the tradition, hell and purgatory are both seen as places of fire, places of cold. One of the quotations makes it very clear that there's a place, that is not hell, but seems to be both, punish people with heat and with cold, etc., etc. I give you handouts because that's what people expect from lectures. So it keeps everybody happy when they ask me for a handout. And then, as you see, I never use it. It's up to you to then go back and see how that handout may or may not relate to what you've been listening to. And when Dara threatened to have, I don't even know what they're called, a PowerPoint, in all of my life, I've never been so humiliated. I have never given a lecture with a PowerPoint. The only visual aid you need is me. But you know, let's get to the point here. I know I would leave as well. That's the best, you know, sensible woman. Listen to all this nonsense. So the souls on the cornices, they're purged, they're not punished for individual sins. They're purged of sinful dispositions, i.e., what it is within them that their propensity to sin that led them to sin. The individual sins have been forgiven. In hell, we know sinners are being punished for eternity for that sin or sins which most typically define them. It's not necessarily their worst sin, but it's a sin that somehow most defines them as individuals, to go back to a point I was making earlier. So the souls rise up through the different cornices, depending on whether or not they had sinned in terms of those particular vices. And during the process, it's a purging process. It's a positive rather than an exclusively punitive form of punishment, which is what happens in hell. It's a restorative form of punishment that improves them spiritually so that they are then able to return to that spiritual condition which allows them to enter into paradise. It's a very positive, productive idea of, you know, what's actually going on. It may not be the way in which we think about pain, but it was certainly the way in which people in the Middle Ages did. That this was a kind of cleansing purgative. And the example of Christ on the cross and the Passion of Christ is, of course, always there. And it's a, you know, central sort of Christ's sacrifice is a central point of reoccurrence within the poem as a whole, but especially in purgatory. And we get that there's nothing problematic there. There's no challenge to conventional thinking. Another step back before I return to Antipurgatorio and then finish is, remember that whilst hell and paradise have a long tradition of representation, indeed, what the afterlife is like has classical precedent. I even give you a brief quotation from Book 6 of the Aeneid just to remind us of that fact. Purgatory became official doctrine at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274. About 50, less, 40 years or so, well, Dante writes about it. There are therefore limited, rather sketchy and chaotic accounts, brief accounts of purgatory. Indeed, scholars have demonstrated, to my mind, fairly convincingly, that one of the things that distinguishes accounts of purgatory from accounts of both hell and paradise, traditional account, is that there is not much interest in the space of purgatory. There's few what they're interested is in the condition, what it is that you need to do whilst you're on earth in order to achieve purgatory. There's a certain pragmatism if you think about it, because in the end, you know, if we accept the system, that's where most of us will go. You know, the idea that any of us is good enough to go straight into paradise, which theoretically at least is a possibility, and you'll find that articulated, and again, in probably the quote from St. Augustine or from Gregory the Great or someone like that in the handout, in the same, is that they wanted to know what, and therefore once they worked out what the moral situation was for the person to be admitted into purgatory, they wanted to then know what the conditions were of purgatory, if you want, what the rules of the game are, how, you know, and how quickly you can get out of there in order to sort of arrive at where you really want to go, to find satisfaction in God and be elevated to paradise. Now, Dante's purgatory is the most original part of the afterlife, precisely because there is a limited tradition of writing about purgatory. He's got enormous freedom. And perhaps it's not surprising that the island is such an inventively rich place, as I sort of highlighted during the opening part of my talk. And therefore, in a sense, anti-purgatory, which is the most original part of this, most original part of the afterlife, in itself becomes emblematic of the originality of this part of the, and the whole ambition that Dante has, which is what I may or may not write about going forward, of wanting to completely refashion the afterlife. What happens in anti-purgatory? In anti-purgatory, souls who have repented and been forgiven are actually punished for particular sins. How is that possible? Where's the logic to that? If the sins have been forgiven. But that's what happened. The excommunicate are made to wait for 30 years, the period of their excommunication, outside of purgatory. Indeed, they're even outside the rest of the mountain. They find themselves right at the base of the mountain, in the same way that they were excluded from the church, both as an institution and the physical churches. And one of the interesting things that Dante does in his representation of purgatory is that, especially the entry through the gate, which is compared to that of a basilica, the listening to the sacred singing, etc., there's a suggestion that once you arrive in purgatory, you're entering into a church. And there's all sorts of interesting associations between the role and function, very complex functions that churches had in late medieval society, and the way in which Dante represents purgatory, which is another area which Dante uses to enrich his representation of purgatory. In a sense, that's their contrapasso. Not only can they not start on that process of purgation that they so desperately want to, they are also being punished. It's unproductive. It doesn't improve them spiritually in any way, in which the pain, the punishment in purgatory itself, are productive. It's an entirely negative existence. They're being punished for the fact that they were excommunicated. In the same way that the souls above them, the negligent, those who repented at the moment of a violent death, who were also negligent because they'd got on with their life, they hadn't thought about the fact that they needed to repent. There's some great quotations about that from Augustine and Peter Lombard. Late repentance was a big issue, a big theological issue. It was a big theological issue because there's a tension in Christianity itself. On the one hand, we can repent at the very last minute and God will forgive us. And we meet loads of characters, starting with Manfred, who did that. On the other hand, are we taking advantage of God in doing this? So we get on, and people saw it in very practical terms. You lead a totally dissolute life. I stopped believing. I come from an Italo-Polish background. What else could I be but brought up a Catholic? But at a certain point, when I asked Sister Lawrence, at about the age of 8 or 9, and remember that I was born soon after the war, if Hitler had repented in the bunker, Sister Lawrence, would God have forgiven him? And she said, oh, yes. Oh, yes. I said, well, that's it. I'm not going to church anymore. And I may very well be damned, but at least I've been damned coherently. I don't want to go anywhere where bloody Hitler is to put you know. So the issue of late repentance was a major theological issue. Dante's very much on the mainstream here. If on the one hand, and I'll finish up on him creating havoc, in the mainstream, it's a problem. And look at those quotations. Both Augustine and Peter Lombard, they go, well, are you really sure that you're going to be okay? He's saying it's actually, isn't it much better that you repent much earlier on rather than wait until the last minute? Because I can't guarantee that you won't be, I'm not saying you won't be damned, but And it's great because he repeats himself. You can, even the translation it's much better in the Latin, but the translation's pretty effective. Are you really sure you're going to be okay? But certainly, whatever happens, you deserve punishment. And in a sense, what Dante's doing, Dante too doesn't like late repentance. Purgation is something extremely serious. And you should be constantly, and his whole poem's about that, look after your immortal soul. Don't just leave things. Don't let other things get in the way. Your primary and most important sort of responsibility is to saving your soul. Don't delay. These guys all delayed. And now they're made to wait. They know they're going to be saved. They know they're going to be united with God. They know they're going to have to go through a process of spiritual improvement, which is purgatory itself. But at the moment, they're just sitting there. It's like sitting in a huge traffic jam, not going anywhere. We all know how frustrating that is. And when it comes to someone like Manfred, I think I once did the sums of how long, if it was going to spend the full period 30 times of his excommunication, it was some huge figure of, 200-300 years. Can you imagine being stuck in a traffic jam for 200 or 300 years? That's what's happening to the guys in anti-purgatory. But the problem is that they are being punished for a particular sin. And this is where, if on the one hand, he's part of the theological mainstream on late repentance, and on the fact that late repentance should be punished, he's punishing them. You could see Augustine sitting on his throne going, yeah, go Dante, give it to them. That how can sin continue to exist in purgatory or on the island if God has already forgiven it? And there's a quotation there. In fact, I will actually go to a quotation because it's a great one. It's the one from, it's number 10. Article 11, whether any venial sins are remitted after this life in purgatory. Reply to object to the argument does not infer that in purgatory venial sin is not remitted, but that it is immediately remitted there. And this seems probable. Basically, what is saying, venial sin, you can go into the afterlife of venial sin, but it remitted immediately. Now, there are a number of issues here, and I will be very quick because I need to finish in the next 7 minutes. Dante does not, and here he again goes against the tradition, distinguish between mortal and venial sin. For Dante, there is just sin, and all sin offends God. Mortal sins are those, if you don't repent, you go to hell. We know that Manfred must have repented his horrible sins, i.e. his mortal sins, or he wouldn't be where we meet. But Dante does say that there are certain sins which persist into purgatory, and these are sins that relate to the way in what our attitude was, both to the church as an institution, the excommunicate, and to the responsibilities we have towards God in terms of our salvation. That those are sins that continue, that we bring with us into purgatory. There's no theological legitimation for that. In fact, it goes against what Thomas says, which is the standard position, that yes, what you have to repent are your mortal sins. It doesn't matter if you forget that, I kicked Dara before and I haven't had time to say sorry to God for having kicked Dara. I'll get into purgatory. That venial sin will be remitted. It'll be forgiven. And I can get on with the process. Dante say no, the sins that will actually linger. He doesn't explain whether those sins have been forgiven. Are they forgiven at the end of the 30-time period? He leaves it hanging in the air. He doesn't explain it. Partly because he knows how problematic his proposal is. Precisely because he does not distinguish. He doesn't say these are venial sins. How could he? How can presumption, which is what Manfred admits that leads to excommunication, be anything other than a mortal sin? Only in a system where there is only a single entity that is sin, could you have that. Dante's, again, he's pulling, as he does with the representation of paradise, he's actually making seem normal, okay, what is anything but in doctrinal terms. Havoc, as I said before. And he doesn't resolve it. It's resolved in a kind of oblique way because it fits in with the concerns and worries and the demand for punishment of those who repent late. It fits in fine in that. But the way in which he does it is theologically incongruous. I don't want to say heretical, but it's certainly unorthodox. Because the idea that within the sphere of purgation, in the sphere of divine forgiveness, because we're not really yet in the sphere of purgation and anti-purgatory, that sin can persist, there is no precedent for that. Now, we should be working on the implications of that. This is what makes Dante's Afterlife really interesting, even more interesting than many of the sort of novelties, of which there are many. There's a real tension here. He's introducing problems into the afterlife. Where does anti-purgatory come from? And I'll finish on this. What's very interesting, and you'll find that in your quotations quite early on, those quotations 8, A, B, C, and D. The standard view is that there is a tripartite afterlife. One thing to remember, just because purgatory hadn't become official doctrine until 1274 doesn't mean that there isn't extensive writing from quite early on about an intermediate state that remains anonymous between heaven and hell. You know, which then subsequently becomes purgatory, is given a name. So there's actually a sophisticated tradition of writing about spaces that are not hell and not paradise, even though they remain unnamed. A bit like Dante's anti-purgatory. The standard view is that we have a tripartite system, and Dante, to a certain extent, is, you know, guilty of this up to a point, you know, of having hell, purgatory, paradise. There's a much more interesting tradition which divides the afterlife into 4. And you'll find examples of that, so that the intermediates are divided into the not very bad and the not very good. And you can see the quotations there. And my argument is, and it's actually quite, is that what Dante's doing, that at the basis of Dante's anti-purgatory, the way in which he anchors it within the tradition is that he views the afterlife as a 4-fold system, which was established. You know, it really crystallizes with Bede. It's picked up by all sorts of other accounts. In the versions, at least, of St. Patrick's Purgatory that I know, it's a 4-fold system as well. And so in the intermediate, you have the not very good and the not very bad. The not very bad are those who are not really bad and therefore haven't been cast down to hell, and they're not very good. And these terms have become technical, although they come from one of the visions which is in your handout. And the not very good are those who weren't really good enough to go straight up to heaven. You've got the quotations are very sort of are very clear as to the distinction. And in a sense, if we think about it, even though with all the differences that are involved, in very simple terms, anti-purgatory houses the not very bad. The people who, you know, are not yet even, but in Dante's system, it's not that they need to be distinguished from the not very good. They can't even be moved into that next category. In the tradition, the 2 categories remain separate. Each of them has their own way of arriving at paradise, the guaranteed paradise, as of course are the inhabitants of anti-purgatory and the inhabitants of purgatory itself. But in Dante's system, the 2 are interconnected because those souls who find themselves in anti-purgatory will, after having spent that particular type of, you know, sitting in the traffic jam, they will then move into purgatory. So there's a continuity. Because if you want, it parallels the upward movement up the mountain and the upward movement up then up through the heavens, up to paradise itself. To me, that's the basis of Dante's because anti-purgatory and purgatory are quite separate, as Dante makes it clear. He says purgatory starts here, therefore whatever has come before in cantos 1 to 9 is something else. And what, in a sense, the best evidence that we have that Dante is thinking of that particular system is not just the distinction between anti-purgatory and purgatory, but it is the fact that with the Valley of the Princes, he introduces a motif, that of the locus amenus, which is a key component of the environment of the not very good. As we know, the locus amenus tradition has classical precedents, medieval Latin, scriptural, Song of Songs, etc., etc. But the only tradition of the locus amenus, which in ideological terms fits the fact that we find a locus amenus in purgatory, on the island in anti-purgatory, is that of the fact that the place inhabited by the not very good, again, the handout will make it clear, is a locus amenus. And indeed, many of the motifs that we find in accounts of the spaces inhabited by the not very good are exactly the same as the environment in which the rulers, the negligent rulers, find themselves, with one vital exception: night falls. And we know how dramatic that first night in purgatory is, and the emphasis is placed, because in conventional accounts of the not very good, night never falls. It's always beautiful light. And what Dante does, and this is what's so interesting, is he actually reverses the system of punishment, the condition of existence of those two categories. In conventional accounts, the not very bad suffer horrible punishments. In Dante's system of the not very bad, they don't suffer any physical pain, because in Dante's system, physical pain is productive, and they cannot do anything productive at this point. Whilst it is the souls who find themselves in purgatory who suffer harrowing punishments, which normally those who could be categorized as the not very good actually found themselves in a serene place, which was a locus amenus, etc., etc. So Dante turns things on the head, but by introducing that locus amenus, that becomes a kind of nub around which we can appreciate the way in which he's drawing on that tradition of a bipartite, intermediate afterlife. Just that in the same way, that Bede and others had a fourfold system, I believe that Dante also has a fourfold system of the afterlife, where different forms of God's justice prevail and different conditions for the inhabitants of those four places prevail. So in Dante we have hell, what he leaves anonymous, but which we term anti-purgatory. Then there's purgatory. Eden, I need to go, there's a quite complicated, but it's not part of really that purgative process. It has personal biographical. It's a place of transition. It's like the bridges that would often take the souls from the intermediate realms to paradise in the account. And then, of course, there's paradise, which, as we've seen, Dante never described. Finally, the beach. The beach is another. Actually, the mountain has four distinct spaces. Why? Because as Cato makes very clear, the beach is not part of the process of purgation. He tells the souls, leave the beach, run away, go to the mountain, because as your quotation, whichever it is, it's an early one, says that's only at the mountain that you can actually start the process of purgation. Thank you. I hope I was clear and I wasn't too boring and I didn't go over too long and I was coherent. That's all one can hope for. Thank you.
Thank you, Zig. That was brilliant. We should open it up to questions there. I'm just going to turn on the screen because we have people online who also like questions. Where's this? Okay. Right, first of all, are there any questions in the room? And if there are questions in the room, you have to come up to the microphone. George. Let's see now.
So thanks so much for this fascinating talk. I would have maybe many questions, but I'll go to the one that is more interesting to me. So you were mentioning the idea that actually Dante is not keeping any memory because it's impossible to keep the memory of paradise. So basically, what is about paradise then? What is it if it's not even a representation of the vision of God? But the question was more about the role of the body. Why then the body is useful in paradise, Dante's body? Like, what do you think is the role of Dante's body in the journey? Is it there? Because not everyone is agreed with the idea that the body's in paradise.
Well, there are two questions. One, what is Paradiso about? One very simple answer. What Paradiso is about, it's the impossibility of offering, a true account of paradise. One can only, as with any encounter between the human and divine, is offer a mediated representation. And that what Dante's doing, in a sense, one of the reasons why he embeds himself so much in the tradition, at least in my view, is that he's precisely saying, in the end, what I'm doing is I'm dealing with accounts of the afterlife, the way in which others have represented the afterlife, and in particular, the way in which others have represented their experience of paradise. He doesn't deny the fact that certain individuals, himself included, he wants us to believe, have actually had this unique privilege, but at the same time wants to remind us that what he can then report to us is a mediated account. For instance, he cannot, the one thing he cannot tell us anything about is what the union with God is like. If, suddenly the alta fantasia loses power and he can't remember anything, and the poem comes to an end. That's the one thing he can't do, and that becomes the key to the whole thing, because therefore, if what happens previously actually involved the direct experience of the divine, he would not have been able to remember it. He can, precisely because he is a human being who is in his body, and the body becomes central, because he is the one person, the one in the afterlife who has a body. And that's hugely important, because he reminds us that he's not one of them, but he's one of us. And that therefore his experience and the way, and therefore the account that he will give of that experience is an account that is sort of adapted to the way, to our needs as embodied beings. And that's very important, because it's what distinguishes him. That is the reason why, because as Dante says in the De Vulgare Eloquentia, we as human beings, as embodied creatures, need signs. We cannot communicate in that privileged manner that let's say, the blessed can communicate amongst themselves, the angels can communicate, the blessed and the saints can communicate with God, that our body is what defines us. It limits us, but it's also hugely important in the experience that Dante has, because it's a reminder of the fact that it's an experience of someone like ourselves, and that therefore the account that he gives us, it's an account that is fatta misura nostra, in a sense. I'm absolutely convinced. I think all the evidence, all Dante time and again, it both drops hints, but it's also quite explicit that he's there with quel d'Adamo, that he's there with his body. I think it's up to people to demonstrate that those many references to his bodily presence in the afterlife are anything other than, references to the fact that the pilgrim is there with his body.
George.
Thank you, Zig. Just one kind of simple question and two kind of smaller sub questions. So you kind of highlight the kind of discrepancies in kind of content, and there's a discrepancy between form and content. Is style important? And are there discrepancies in style? How do we deal with that? And so two more specific questions would be, how important is the canto form, so you brought the canticle, kind of what the canticles are about. Is the canto form important? And maybe even more specifically, you point out about the kind of the change to the Empyrean. Is there a stylistic change that you notice within Paradiso 30 itself?
I started thinking about this in terms of how does the Commedia hang together? And I've been thinking about this for a very long time. And it's a question really that goes right back to some of the 14th century commentators. And it's a question that we've not been very good at answering as Dante scholars. Often because things have been oversimplified. Most of you will be aware of the distinction between sort of poetry and non-poetry that Croce made between sort of doctrine and poetry. And it often gets ridiculed. It's actually a very useful and powerful insight because it makes us aware of the fact that what we read in the poem is at least to be distinguished between a poetic and a non-poetic, which is all the doctrinal matter for Croce. It's much too simplistic, but he's asking the right question. How can, let's say something like the lyric effusion of some of the lines that we find in the Valley of the Princes within a locus amenus, how do they relate then, say, to Beatrice's lesson on the spots of the moon in Paradiso 2, which is one of the most densely complex doctrinal canti, of the whole Commedia, which to this day I have never really properly mastered. I'll hold my hand up and admit it. So there's an extraordinary complexity to the poem. And I've given lectures where I talk about the structures. And the ones that you raise, there is essentially, when we talk about structure and Dante, it's moral structure. When Mark Cogan wrote his very good and very powerful and persuasive book over 20 years ago now called something, I've forgotten now.
Seal on the Wax.
The what?
Seal on the Wax.
Yeah, but it came out with Notre Dame University Press, which is a really good, he's almost apologetic that he's writing about the moral structure. He's almost saying, well, it's all been done. But it hasn't. If anything, that I come out to say, there's all sorts of moral issues that are not resolved. Some of them I don't see how they can be resolvable, like the issue of sin in purgatory. It's just there. It's a fact of Dante's afterlife, and we just have to like it, and lump it. But amongst the many structures are precisely what we have with Dante is a poet who is characterized by stylistic experimentation, formal experimentation, which goes all the way through the poem. And I've always been rather reticent to suggest that there are radical changes in style between the canticles. All the canticles are characterized by plurilingualism. Plurilingualisms of different types, but still they are plurilingual, i.e. they contaminate they break the rules of medieval writing because they bring together every register, etc. I don't want to go. So there's that. Now, to what extent does the formal experimentation complement, how does it relate to the experimentation that lies behind the creation of a new type of afterlife? Yeah, fundamentally so. Because, for instance, let's say what we have in Dante is that we find different sort of discourses coming together in order to create the complex vision of the afterlife that he does. The two are kind of, you can't separate one from another. I'm not talking some, the form and content in some banal way, but it's fundamental, because if you're going to create a world or worlds that are as complex as those of Dante's, you are inevitably going to be drawing on different traditions, which therefore means you're drawing on different discourses, which means different vocabulary, different registers, different styles, etc. The whole issue of another big issue is precisely the relationship between the canto and the canticle. How does a canto function? How does a cantica function? That's a massive topic which we've only barely begun to discuss because we took it for granted. Questions weren't asked. I was the first person many years ago to actually sit down and say, why did Dante call a canto a canto? We just told it, everyone just accepted it. There wasn't even an entry in the Encyclopedia Dantesca. And then once you ask that question and you go, it's another one of those true, it's not something to be tested, it's not something to be asked. A canto is a canto. But as you will see from that quotation from Benvenuto da Imola, who is head and shoulders the best of the 14th century commentators, what does he call it? He calls them capitoli. Which immediately should tell you that Dante's use of canto is weird, like so much of what he does. But it's even more complex, as one of the people here is working on vertical Dante, which was one of the ways of challenging conventional ways of looking at the structures. But there are loads of other structures that, you know, if we take something like politics, there's a political strand that works its way through right up to the Empyrean, all the way through the poem. So there's a political structure. How does that political structure interrelate, let's say, with many other structures that go through the poem? Why don't we study? Yeah, we conventionally study in terms of cantos. The Lectura Dantis is great, but it also has many faults. It stops us thinking in other ways. Already the vertical Dante, bringing the cantos with the same number together, was a way of challenging that particular form of analysis. And there's no doubt that Dante does think in terms of cantos having the same number, having connections, some explicitly, others less explicitly, etc. But what I find even more interesting, and there's really almost no work done on this, why don't we look at, let's say, how the Giona of Pride works? We take and look at, rather than look at each individual canto that looks at pride, let's look at how that particular bit of the afterlife works, in the same way that I've been trying to look at how does anti-purgatory work. Even more so, I've just recently finished a rather long piece, because I'm very interested in the heaven of the fixed stars, for all sorts of reasons. I won't go in, but that's the heaven of all the heavens to which Dante dedicates the largest number of cantos, more than the cantos that he dedicates to the Empyrean. That just in itself is interesting, but we don't look at an individual heaven and see what's going on. Why is it in one instance he'll begin at the start of a canto, another one he'll enter a heaven halfway through or towards the end? There's just so much work to do in terms of how Dante represents the afterlife. One of the things why I'm interested in the heaven of the fixed stars is because there's the firmament, there's the whole issue from the Bible about the waters above and below the firmament, of which, of course, there is no trace in Dante's Aristotelian Ptolemaic system. But what Dante does, and I hope to write on this quite soon, is he drops all sorts of hints from the tradition of the debates around the waters above the firmament, when in his descriptions of what's going on in the heaven of the fixed stars, precisely to say, hey guys, I know that there's a debate issue here, I choose not to do it, but at the same time I'm introducing my sort of reflections on it, but indirect. And that's another element in this sort of rethinking of what the afterlife, because it's not just a rethinking of the afterlife. I lied to you guys. It's really a rethinking of the universe, which is a much more complex issue.
Did you want to, are there questions?
Yeah, one comment and one question.
Okay, so would the person asking the question online want to turn on their microphone and ask? Make your...
Kimberly has something.
Kimberly?
Yeah, I can read once it's...
Should be able to.
Can you read it?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Just thank you so much for that. It's just brilliant to hear your thoughts live, action and responsive. I'm interested in, and I think a few of the other questions and your responses touched on it, but this aspect of Dante being embodied throughout the process of the poem, in the sense of the relationship between that and biblical texts, and the role of God in the biblical texts and breathing. And so I'm just thinking about if you could talk a bit more about the rhetorical strategies that you were discussing at the opening, and how you see that by the time we get to the end of the Paradiso. And I am a poet, full disclosure, so it could be my wishful thinking that's making us seem more powerful than we may be. So thank you very much.
That's very kind. I'll be honest with you. I've never really spent too much time thinking about the pilgrim's body and the presence of his, for me, really, I haven't got that much more to say. I could sort of go into bullshit mode, which I already mentioned beforehand. I've been told I'm pretty good at, but I'm also reluctant to do that. For me, the question of his body is really to define his identity as other. Now, what's interesting, if we move away from the pilgrim, is why is it that we think of the inhabitants of the afterlife who don't have a body as if they were embodied? And in some of the cases of the people from hell, for instance, we all have an image of Ulysses. But Dante doesn't describe it. He's one of those souls that is genuinely bodiless because he's engulfed in a flame. Is Francesca sort of conventionally sort of good looking or not? We don't know. We all have an image of her. It's extraordinary the power of suggestion that there is. And that it's important for him, for Dante, I believe, to embody those without bodies. And then he develops that, the theory of the aerial body, which is a lot less crazy than sometimes it's suggested, because there are actually Christian precedents for what he's doing. He again sort of twists, manipulates, brings different elements together, but it's not just simply a literary invention as was maintained for a long time. In more recent years, we've become aware that notions of airy bodies are part of the Christian tradition. That part of the way in which he makes the characters psychologically complex and believable, and therefore effective as tools to encourage us to change our nasty little ways, is to make them think that they're like us, despite the fact that they find themselves in the afterlife and our body. He really wants them to be, people that we could actually be meeting. And that, in a sense, the fact that he's there as our representative, makes that sort of, that it's an exchange that's the same way that's happening with the guys in here. Unfortunately, not with you, because my exchange with you are an airy body and I'm an airy body, because through the medium of Zoom, that's all we are. And I think that's more the way in which I've thought about, the issues of the body and embodiment, which are crucial and vital. Just think of the huge reception of Dante and how much of that is predicated on making, on giving bodies to those who don't have bodies, if I may put it like that.
Julia Bolton.
Yeah, Julia, did you want to ask a question?
I would love to say I really appreciate this idea of the embodiment in the poem of Dante and us, because we respond with Dante. And in fact, as readers, we sin all the same sins that he is sinning in interactions with the other characters. What I find so stunning when I read it, when you get to paradise and he sees God, mi sembra l'impave pinta nelle nostre figlie. God is embodied as we are. It's a mirror reflection. And I sense that that is very much the sort of incarnational theology that Dante is using. He's kind of Adam who becomes a kind of Christ figure, but it's always in that body. And then when he describes even the child nursing the mother with the tongue, with the milk, he's recalling his own being an orphan from his mother. There's very much a sense of the body, even in the highest Imperium.
Thank you, Julia. I agree. I just don't know enough about it. But people, working on sort of Christ becoming man, the relationship, what that means for us, the sort of the incarnational poetics, as it's been termed, in relation to, what Dante's doing in the Commedia and elsewhere, are all central elements. But we need to really begin. In a sense, people have worked on the incarnational poetics, but what we don't really have are significant and substantial studies of Dante's representation of Christ, which is remarkable. We should really be starting from there and then moving on to the, which I have no doubt that you're right, that they're absolutely, that's one of the ideological sort of pillars upon which Dante constructs his poem. Which is actually, one of the things that I've learned over the years is how little I do know. That however much I've spent most of my, probably the biggest chunk of my life thinking about this author and his text, there's huge swathes which, my knowledge is very superficial. I can appreciate why it's interesting and important, etc., but I don't really know enough.
Okay. Thank you, Julia, and thank you to our online audience. Sadly, we have run out of time, and I'm very conscious of the fact that we have promised Zig a pint and a pizza in the Abbey, which anyone in the room is more than welcome to join us. For those of you online, I'm afraid you're going to have to after yourselves on that particular score. Now, as advertised, just to let you know, because next Monday here in Ireland it is a bank holiday, we are going to have a word that was used in my breakfast table this morning, a hiatus. So we have a week off, and then we're back for the third lecture, but it won't be in this room, it will be in the CAC seminar room for the third lecture, and that will be with Gaia Tomazzoli, who's going to be talking to us about new, very, very exciting digital projects on Dante that are currently happening. So do please tune in or come to that. But please join me in thanking Zig for quite a brilliant, thought-provoking and havoc-wreaking lecture. Thank you, Zig. Well done.
Thank you so much. And if anybody feels that I should sort of pack up lecturing like this, just send me an email. I like honesty.